Here are two banknotes. One comes from Senegal, the other from Cameroon. Each note represents a different currency, yet both belong to the same scheme, one that pegs both currencies to the euro at a rate decided by the French treasury. This framework, the CFA franc, is the foundation upon which France conducts its foreign policy. Using it, France controls the monetary sovereignty of 14 nations, representing more than 200 million people. So while the French Empire may be relegated to the history books, the conduct of business has largely remained the same. Imperialism has simply traded its rifles for balance sheets and its bullets for banks. You see, in pre-colonial times, many African communities had adopted cowrie seashells as a medium of exchange. By the turn of the 19th century, these seashells were so embedded in African society that they began to be integrated into the imperial monetary systems of the time, and there was even an official exchange rate with the French franc. But having expanded across Africa, France sought to monopolize the regional trade links and monetary systems, and so during the 1890s it made the franc the official currency throughout all of its colonies. In doing so, Paris was able to exercise control over trade, taxation, and the flow of resources throughout French-speaking Africa. By the 1930s, France came to dominate its colonies' circulation of money. The French Empire was at its zenith, but things changed following World War II. Years of occupation under Nazi Germany left the French economy in ruins, and seeking to re-establish itself as a global hegemon, leaders in Paris looked to their vast colonial project in West Africa. France joined the Bretton Woods system, and the French franc was devalued to set a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. But as these reforms were taking place, Africa was decolonizing itself. A weaker currency only made matters worse, and so to maintain their foothold in Africa, French economists devised a new currency, the CFA, or French Colonies in Africa franc. In its infancy, the CFA franc was pegged to its French counterpart at a rate of 1.7 to 1, but by 1948 it had changed to 2 to 1. The deliberate overvaluation of the CFA franc allowed Paris to strengthen its own currency against the US dollar, while simultaneously undermining Africa's export competitiveness in favour of French trade. In other words, colonies within Africa's franc zone would experience artificially inflated costs for exporting raw materials to anywhere besides France. Moreover, French companies gained access to African labour and said materials at below market rates, while finished goods and services could be sold back to Africa at above market prices. Profits from French mines and operations could also be funneled back to French banks without fear of foreign exchange fluctuations. Thus, one could argue that France built its post-war recovery, in part, through a wealth transfer from Africa. Either way, this form of neo-imperialism was so ruthless, so sly, and yet so unique that it earned a name of its own, La France Afrique. That being said, an empire is merely a house of cards. France had damaged its reputation trying to crush anti-colonial revolts in Algeria, with little to show for it. Paris now had to look towards more covert, less violent, and more palatable ways to hang on to its remaining African colonies. So it set about hijacking legitimate decolonization and installing local puppet governments who were loyal to Paris. These puppets became the sentinels of France's neo-colonial empire, by maintaining the CFA franc zone and allowing the French a continued military presence in Africa. Only Guinea rejected the proposal. Its president Sékou Touré declared that his people preferred poverty and freedom to riches and slavery. By rejecting the CFA franc, Guinea looked to develop its own currency with support from the Soviet Union. But France felt it needed to make an example of Guinea. By way of Operation Parcel, it sought to provoke civil war by arming Guinean insurgencies, whilst flooding the country with counterfeit banknotes to induce hyperinflation and crash its economy. Worse still, the French adopted a scorched earth policy on their way out, dismantling Guinea's power grid, destroying medicine, and even burning plans for the capital's sewage system, all the while attempting to block its membership to the UN. You get the idea. Likewise, in 1963, Togo's president Sylvanus Olympio was assassinated, just days before establishing a Togolese currency. His assassins were loyal to Nsingbe Eyadema, a proponent of French colonialism whose family went on to rule in Togo to the present day. But here's the kicker. France wanted to look as though it was simply cooperating with its colonies. In 1958, the CFA franc was split into two currencies covering the central and western states. A decade later, their respective central banks were Africanized and relocated from Paris to Yaoundé and Dakar. Though this turned out to be a ruse. The fundamental policy remained the exact same. It demanded that CFA member states deposit half their exchange reserves at the French treasury, plus another 20% for financial liabilities. What this means is that only 30% of the money remained in Africa. Reforms were made to this as recently as 2019, but France still holds veto powers in these institutions, and French policymakers sit in key positions on their respective boards. Though advocates of the CFA franc point to its stability, a lack of monetary sovereignty limits the tools available to those who use it. When Paris ditched the French franc, its CFA counterpart simply became pegged to the euro. Thus, economic growth for CFA member states now comes at the mercy of the European Central Bank, whose main concern is to mitigate inflation within the eurozone. But for CFA member states, this ideology is counterproductive. You see, achieving real economic growth often involves policies that drive inflation up. The two just don't go hand in hand. For instance, inflation rates in Ivory Coast have been markedly lower than in neighbouring Ghana. But growth-wise, Ivory Coast has gone backwards. The country's real GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than in 1978, whilst Ghana's has consistently risen year on year. Meanwhile, Gabon, Congo and Cameroon are yet to top their respective peaks of 1976, 1984 and 1986. In other words, these countries have seen little to no economic growth in decades. What's more, francophone countries with independent currencies, like Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia, have all seen consistent economic growth. But however you frame it, the CFA scheme has been invaluable to France. Its former colonies serve as satellites that power the French economy. Each one acts as a source of cheap raw materials that benefit French corporations as much as they do the French treasury, as it doesn't need to withdraw its exchange reserves for African imports. Niger, for instance, is indispensable to France's nuclear energy sector, accounting for 20% of French uranium imports. However, key mining operations are controlled by the French multinational Orano. So in the end, France enjoys most of the profits. Uranium accounts for more than 40% of Niger's total export volume, but thanks to the CFA scheme, it makes up only 3% of the country's GDP. Meanwhile, Total Energies has dominated Gabonese oil production, whilst French conglomerate Bolloré controls plantations in neighbouring Cameroon along with most of West Africa's major ports. It's not by chance that former French President Jacques Chirac once said that much of the money in French banks comes from exploiting Africa, and that France would become a third world economy without it. Even in 1957, then President François Mitterrand admitted that without Africa, France would have no history in the 21st century. Now, the CFA states are looking to free themselves, and not just financially. Ivorian officials recently announced that all French troops must begin withdrawing from the country in 2025. It's part of a broader campaign to break away from French hegemony. Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso were the first to do so, amidst a wave of coups d'etats in the Sahel. Next, and within just hours of each other, Chad and Senegal followed suit. For context, France has intervened militarily in Africa more than 50 times since the 1960s, from supporting corrupt puppet regimes to armed combat. If the trend continues, it could spell the end for La France-Afrique. However, he who controls the money supply of a nation controls the nation. This is the essence of France-Afrique, so naturally, many within the CFA franc zone are talking about alternatives. The obvious route involves establishing a regional currency bloc outside of French influence. Ergo, the ECOWAS Union serves as the natural starting point. Doing this would effectively restructure Africa's CFA franc zone around Nigeria, given it dominates regional population and GDP. Moreover, ECOWAS presents a natural symbiosis, seeing as most of West Africa could benefit from Nigerian oil. Efforts have been made to do just this, with the ECO set to be in circulation by 2027. Yet it fails to address the root of the problem. The ECO would remain pegged to the euro, subjecting it to policies designed not for Africa but for the eurozone. Moreover, France would become the guarantor, meaning it can oversee where African reserves are held. So in essence, the ECO is nothing but a rebranded CFA franc. Ultimately, the best solution may be for individual nations to develop their own central banks and currencies, anchored to a benchmark currency with adjustable rates. It would give monetary sovereignty to 14 nations, home to more than 200 million people. But having a tug-of-war with France may well come at a cost, so there'd need to be collective will. Most importantly, local elites who've benefited most from French exploitation would need to be dealt with, and replaced by individuals who prioritise their people over personal gain. It's something that needs to change from within, because corruption runs deep in Africa, and tragically it may again prove to be its Achilles heel. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video. A lot of effort goes into making them, and if you haven't yet subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.